Only like 3 people.
Good morning. That's much better. Now the exam will be easier. Just kidding. Today is the last day of the 5th week, right? Today is the 26th. Been really the 5th week. I still have to fix that. And on Monday we have our next exam in this room at a regular scheduled time with a 10-minute grace period, all the same things as the last time. For the most part, everybody did a great job of being here on time, so please do that again. If you were late, please don't be late. The exam, I think we'll have time to talk about more of a review today. But it'll be on 2 through 5, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 will be on the next exam. Okay? This exam will be 2, 3, 4, and 5. Research methods, sociological questions, culture, socialization, and social interaction. And then if you read ahead to chapter 6, that's fine. It means you just have, you're a little bit ahead for the next exam. After Monday, we have that week of lecture, one more week of lecture, then we have fall break, not spring break. Okay? And the next exam after that is the 10th, the 20th of October. I just like to go over this as much as possible because every semester I get 1 or 2 students who say, I didn't know when the exams were, you didn't tell us. You can always check the syllabus, and I'm telling you. Any questions about the schedule? Okay. So we don't have that much left to do in chapter 5. We just got finished talking about ethnomethodology. Who'd like to remind us what that long word ethnomethodology means? Yes?
It's the attempt to show people how they know the common sense rules apply.
To force people into discussing and explaining the common sense rules, the informal norms, the folk ways in society, right? And then we went through a series of breaching experiment. Well, we went through one breaching experiment. We discussed other breaching experiments, right? Everybody remember that? Okay, good. Ethnomethodology also covers a couple of other areas, and one of them is conversational analysis. This is a very detailed process. I'll tell you a quick story. So I came back to teach here after, I graduated from here a long time ago, and then I came back to teach here 2015, so like 11 years ago, 10, 11 years ago. So I had this couple of favorite professors. When I was a student, you probably have some as well. And I was talking to somebody. So this guy was in the communications department. Very funny guy, and he was the one who actually started talking about Goffman in the communications class. That's how I first learned about it, believe it or not. And I assumed that he was no longer around. And I was having a conversation with somebody in the faculty in the communications department, just having a conversation about something completely different, and I mentioned his name. I said, you ever hear from Professor Sanders? I said, really liked him. And I always had a question for him. We had a class in the humanities, a small classroom, and the window, the chairs were always facing the blackboard, the whiteboard. By then it was a blackboard. And on the final, he switched the orientation to facing away from it. And I always thought there was something cool about that or something interesting that he would do that, but I never got to ask him why he did it. So the person in the communications department there's a reason I'm telling you the story. So the person in the communications department says, oh, he's retired, but he still comes back to campus once a week to do conversational analysis with a group of faculty who like doing conversational analysis. I said, oh, really? Does he still have a UAlbany email address? Yeah. So I emailed him. And I told him, it's weird because he doesn't have any way of remembering me. Anyway, we get together. We get together and talk, about teaching and everything. And I say to him at the end of the conversation, I said, why did you turn the class, the chairs around for the final? He goes, I didn't do that. It was Wilkie, the other teacher. I completely had it all mixed up. The reason why I'm bringing up this story aside from the fact that I was wrong about who did it, was that he still comes back, they still have a group, and I did sit in with them a few times, who still do conversational analysis because it's a very interesting process. It is the analysis of conversation in minute detail. And it is a very micro level analysis, right? An examination of all the facets of conversation, from the smallest filler words, such as and because these are all transcribed, just in case it's not clear. These conversations are transcribed, so that the analysis is of a transcription of the conversation. People agree to this, unless it's like a public conversation. If it's a political speech, they don't have to ask permission for it. But a lot of times it's a conversation between two people on a phone or in person, and it's made available to the analyst. And everything is analyzed, including the timing of pauses, the number of interruptions, the number of overlaps between conversation. Remember we talked about turn taking and phone calls? And it's I could show it to you, but it looks like chicken scratch. It's a piece of, it's paper that is marked up like, there's like all kinds of writing on it with timing and numbers. And they actually have, believe it or not, it's not on the slide, they actually draw a diagonal line from when the pitch of somebody's voice goes up or the pitch of somebody's voice goes down. That's how much detail goes into this. Again, trying to understand the micro level interactions between people. This includes openings. What about the conversation can you clearly identify as an opening to a conversation? Right. So if they had it, they did this with this lecture today, or most of my lectures, what would be the opening? Good morning, right? That's the opening. We're going to get started. I turn down the lights, and you know that it's time for us to start this conversation, right? I mean, it seems obvious, but if it was written down, and you never been here before, you'd find it. And there are many others. Closings. How do you know class is over? I usually give you some kind of indication, right? See you next time. Make sure you read the chapter. That's all I have for today, that kind of thing, right? And again, you're here, you know that, but if it were some class you've never been to or some conversation, you're looking for these openings and these closings. I didn't bring my book. Turn-taking cues. Right? What do you think about this? Right? What was your experience with this? I walk around the class. How about you? How about you? That's a turn-taking cue, right? And again, it's not always about this class, but these are examples that we do here. So it's a very detailed analysis of conversation. There are others too. I mean, it's a lot, but again, this is what you need to know. But if I showed it to you, it would just look like a bunch of scribble. That's why I'm not going to try to do that. You can look it up. Any questions about conversational analysis? Okay. Two other things that come at the end of the chapter. I think two or three. Interactional vandalism. I've done all the talking this morning. What's interactional vandalism? Yes. The expected rules, the expected hierarchy of conversation, right? If, this is, just an example, but, and it's not a big deal, but in some ways it is. I get emails from students that say, hey, really? It's like, it's not a big deal, but you need to know the hierarchies of society, especially when you get a job. If you're sending a thank you note to the recruiter or to the hiring manager that you met, and you write them an email and say, hey, that's pretty much the end of your time there, unless they're young people that are encouraging you to speak that way, right? But it should, that's one example. There's lots of others in the textbook. What kind of examples do they give in the textbook? That's probably more important. I mentioned we have an exam on Monday. If you're prepared, you will do well. Yes? Uh-huh. Right. The woman who's in a business suit, and construction workers who were kind of blue-collar workers, and then the woman who's in a business suit who apparently had a white-collar job, and they were kind of giving her a hard time. Yeah, catcall, right, exactly. And, that was an example of interactional vandalism. They were not apparently of the same social status, and there are expectations of subordination and those who are in more powerful positions. So if you're walking through the campus center and you see a friend and you raise your voice because they're a little ways down the hall and I'm walking by and I hear you say, hey, wait up, I want to have lunch with you, and it's a friend of yours and a student, and I'm watching this, I'm going, yeah, these two students, that's cool. I would have done that when I was a student with one of my friends, that's fine. But if you did that to, the president of the university, hey, wait up, I want to have lunch with you. He's a very nice guy, by the way. He probably would laugh and have a conversation with you, but the truth is that's not the right approach, right? So that would be an example of interactional vandalism. By the way, just 2 seconds, he comes from a sociology background, president. So he'd be a little bit more understanding than maybe somebody else, but he'd probably say, by the way, nice to meet you, by the way, that's interactional vandalism. He might just say that with a smile on his face, right? Or maybe he wouldn't even say that. He's very polite, so. All right. I don't remember if it's the last thing or not. No, there's 2 more, yeah. Who'd like to tell us what the cosmopolitan canopy means? Again, this is a micro-level analysis. I have time. I have class, and then I gotta go pitch an exam, so I have time. Yeah. Yes? Right, correct. That's exactly what it is, right? Cosmopolitan is an analogy for urban areas, cities. So when you read, if you read about cities, what do we want? I teach about demography, and we'll probably get to some of this at the end of the semester, so there is truth that there are problems in cities, but what do we usually hear about people who live in cities? They don't get along real well, right? You have this group here, and you have that group here, and you have the other group here, and they're all in conflict with each other, and they don't like each other, and they have different opinions, and they're, always getting on, each other's nerves, and all that kind of stuff. And there's some truth to that. But there was a study done in cities that pointed out when people are living in the same places, they tend to have the same problems, and they tend to work together, and they tend to get along. Much more than you might hear in the media. Right? People who are poor tend to understand the problems of other people who are poor. People that are facing, crime in their neighborhood tend to understand the problems of other people who have crime in their neighborhood. So this kind of dispels, at a micro level, a lot of the media representations of life in cities. Any comments or questions about that? People do work together. People do help each other out, even if they're from different backgrounds. And there's one more. Any questions? And the last one is the compulsion of proximity. And we kind of touched on this before. Now it's always easy to point back to the lockdown year or so during COVID, right? So we locked down, we had classes on Zoom, we had classes online. right? And what do they say about the result of that now? What do you hear a lot about, maybe your, you know, from your own experience or from what you've read or heard about the impact on students 3 years, 5 years later? Yeah, it didn't go very well. It set people back, right? Especially students. That there was, even though you got to ask questions of your teachers, and I was online with my students and all this stuff, there was something missing, right? What do you think was missing? I mean, you guys went through this, right? Were you in high school at the time or something? At 5 years ago? Beginning of high school, right? How did you feel about the lack of proximity? Oh, a lot of you went back early though, right? I mean, some of you went back right away, some of you stayed a little later, stayed out a little later. How did you feel about when you were locked down? Did you feel like something was missing, or is that overrated? Yes? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there was a lot of those things. They let students drop like up until the last day of class here, I think. And yeah, no, you're right, you're right. Anybody else? I mean, we were on live, they were, literally this close to the screen, and I was this close to the screen, and we were talking. But there was a lot of other stuff. Yeah, I just forgot about this. So we had like one semester, Nolan was here, and some of the students started coming in, and I would still be on Zoom. And that was really weird, right? They weren't in the room, they were allowed to come back to campus. But I was still in Zoom for another semester. So sometimes, they were taking classes in person, but a lot of the faculty weren't here. It was very strange, you're right. So all this has to do with the need for being in the same place at the same time. Humans, studies have shown, have a need for in-person, co-presence interaction to best understand people and their interactions. And again, you don't get very much nonverbal communication on a Zoom screen. Students weren't turning on their cameras, which you know why. They can just go back to sleep. But that's all related to the compulsion of proximity, right? So I just one other question. I'm just curious because I think I've talked about this before. We talked about developing independence and a lot of the things that you gain from going away to school. All of you can stay in touch with your families and your friends through FaceTime and all those other video formats. Is that just as good? Does that help a lot, or is it not? As you just realize it's just a screen. What do you think? Right. No. But I'm saying the people who are here now have a big difference when I was a student here. When you were a student here, when I got it, your parents dropped you off, and then you see them until Thanksgiving, right, or whatever like that. And you call them on the phone, but that was free. Do you think that makes a big difference, being able to see your family and your friends? Yeah. Can't go to the movies with them, stuff like that. What were you gonna say?
I was just gonna say, it makes it better, but it doesn't substitute it, like, so much screens, it's like, stop, there's no actually.
Yeah, I think that's the point, right? There is a human need, even if you can have some alternatives, it's much better when you're in person. And that's really what this is about. You get a micro level issue with social interaction. Okay. Any questions about that? I see people walking through the hallways on FaceTime. Like, I don't think they ever stop doing that. I think that they're just always on FaceTime with their friends. You ever see, you have sweet, that must be really annoying and sweet, right? Once they put headphones in, you constantly hear them talking to their families, telling them everything everything that goes on in school, all that kind of stuff, right? Okay. No questions about these issues and what that we started today? Okay. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna turn on the lights, and I'm gonna turn off the screen, and I'm just gonna walk through the topics that you were responsible for since we have some extra time. It shouldn't be a surprise to you, all the things that we covered, and the chapters. I'm not gonna read you lectures, but this is what you're responsible for. So, you're responsible for the reading of chapter 2 about research questions. We started out that topic, and you should just be checking this off in your notes. We went over this, and that you have it. And for the reading. So is sociology a science? We asked that question when we discussed if and how sociology is a science. We then walk through the scientific method, the steps in the scientific method, individually. And then I added one extra, I believe it's one extra section that is not covered in the textbook, I think, because they've gone back and forth with this in the chapter. So who can remember what the last, I'm not gonna go through the whole thing, but who can remember what the last step that I added was? Yes. Repeat, right? So if you say, well, you know, it's not in the textbook, well, because we went over here. So all the steps that are in the textbook plus repeat. Again, we went through the different research designs. You should be familiar with the different research designs and the things we talked about. And all the different steps. We talked also about understanding cause and effect. Understanding cause and effect. Discussed correlation. We discussed independent and dependent variables. I may give you, I gave you one example in class, I may give you other examples where you have to be able to identify the independent versus dependent variable. We talked about research involving human subjects. Research involving human subjects. And why that, what you need to know about when you do research involving human subjects. And that is, you need to read the whole chapter. Those are the things we went over together in chapter 2. Chapter 3 was about culture. If you remember, I said the more you understand culture, the more you understand a lot of things going forward in this class. We talked about the relationship between culture and society. We talked about the relationship between culture and society. We discussed the importance and differences between material and non-material culture, what they are and how they are different. Material versus non-material culture. We discussed subcultures and countercultures. Subcultures and countercultures. Again, you should just be going through notes going, yep, got that, yep, I got that. Subcultures and countercultures. We talked about assimilation and multiculturalism. Assimilation and multiculturalism were the same discussion. We discussed cultural universals. And then we discussed the linguistic relativity hypothesis. Who wants to volunteer to remind me? Can you do it? Email me about something? If you remind me, I will post the video about the linguistic relativity. I'll try to do it, but if you remind me, I'll make sure I do it. So we watched that video about the linguistic relativity hypothesis. I will post that. You know, I'm not putting all the pressure on you, but if you could send me a reminder, that would be great. Okay, so that goes in the video. And then we concluded our discussion of chapter 3 with Baudrillard's hyperreality, theory of hyperreality, John Baudrillard's theory of hyperreality. You need to know the different stages or simulations. And yeah, there was a little more in Japanese, but that's what we covered. Chapter 4 was about socialization. And we talked about we talked about socialization, we talked about social reproduction, what those are. We talked about social roles, so socialization, social reproduction, social roles. And then we discussed George Herbert Mead's model of child development. So you need to know what it was, the focuses, and the stages, what they mean, what he meant by that. We talked briefly about Charles Horton Cooley's looking glass self. John Piaget's model of child development. Again, the same thing, what are the stages, what was the central focus, those kinds of things. What was he saying? We talked about primary versus secondary socialization. We discussed agents of socialization, agents of socialization. We discussed the study that was done called in the book Nurture Shock. Talk about the results of that study, Nurture Shock. We talked about anticipatory socialization. And we talked about gender socialization. And those are the things that we covered in chapter 4. And then we covered chapter 5. We discussed what the study of daily life teaches us. What the study of daily life teaches us in small groups. We discussed Irving Goffman's presentation of self in everyday life. And if you also remind me, if you remind me, I'll put up that video as well. The short video about where he got the idea from. We discussed the dramaturgical approach and what that means to him. We discussed where the idea, no, that's a joke. You don't have to do that. That was a little trivia. You don't have to know where the idea we got to. No extra charge for that. We discussed the dramaturgical approach. We discussed impression management performances and what goes into that. We discussed what Goffman believed was evidence of social order. What Goffman believed was evidence of social order. We discussed unfocused versus focused interactions. unfocused versus focused interaction. We discussed nonverbal communication. They still don't get the joke? No, we did discuss it. Right? What nonverbal communication means, what was discussed. We discussed Paul Ekman's facial action coding system, FACS. We discussed ethnomethodology, what it is and what it is not. Ethnomethodology, what it is and what it is not. We discussed conversational analysis today. We discussed interactional vandalism today. We discussed the cosmopolitan canopy today. And we discussed the compulsion of proximity today. All those are part of chapter 5. So you need to read 2, 3 if you haven't done it. We did 2, 3, 4, and 5. Those areas between 40 and 50 questions. We have much more, so it's more likely going to be 50 questions this time. It's going to be either 40, 45, or 50, but this is a lot more material than last time, so I would imagine it's going to be 50 questions. In fact, I know it's 50 questions. I forgot. I'm just going to go over it one more time, but I basically written the exam, so I have 50 questions on it, unless I take something out. But you should expect 50 questions. That means you need to be on time, right? You get 55 minutes. It means that if you come late, that really cuts into your time. Please be on time. Please go to the bathroom before you leave and before the exam. And good luck. See you in a little bit.